Thank you, Junaid Bhai. Honorable Justice of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, the esteemed members of the corporate fraternity, and respected members of the audience. Very good afternoon to you all. I'm Abul Azad. I'm a barrister at law and an advocate of the Honorable High Court Division of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, and I'm a partner of Eden Chambers, a law firm that specializes in corporate and banking transactions. Now, I'm here to talk about tax and securities today, particularly about deduction of tax from distribution of profit of a mutual fund or an alternative investment fund. Now, there are many issues and ambiguities and discrepancies arising out of our tax laws that are being addressed by our courts, but given the constraint of time, I'll just focus on this particular issue today. Now, before I move on to the crux of the matter, I would like to explain very briefly the concept of mutual fund or an alternative investment fund. So, these funds are basically a collection of investments such as stocks, bonds, and other funds. These are owned by a group of investors. These are managed by a professional asset or fund manager. And these are held in trust by a trustee. So mutual funds and alternative investment funds that I'll be talking about today are essentially trust funds, and I'll be referring to the term trust funds for the purpose of convenience. Now, so basically, when a person wants to invest in the capital market, ideally or traditionally speaking, that person would be purchasing securities such as stocks and bonds. So an investor would, for example, directly purchase shares from a company. Now, for small investors, this poses a problem, in as much as that small investors with little resources or little amount of money may not be able to purchase shares of many companies. Moreover, small investors or investors in general may not have the necessary skills or knowledge to know which shares to buy, which stocks to invest in. So this is where the concept of trust funds come into play. So in this scenario, small investors, many small investors for that matter, can put in their little money into a fund known as the trust fund. So the trust fund is essentially a pool of money collected from many small investors. And then the fund invests that money collected into different corporations and companies who can buy stocks and bonds. So essentially what has happened is that the small investors who could not have purchased or diversified into many stocks, the fund now helps them purchase many stocks in a way. So these are the advantages of these trust funds. They allow asset diversification, as I've just said. There's a scope to avail professional management because these trust funds are being managed by a professional who have the required skills about and knowledge about the stock market, and hence they can invest with proper knowledge. And these mutual funds and alternative investment funds also allow or reduce transaction costs along with many other advantages. I won't get into those advantages at the moment. I'll just point out the relevant laws that govern mutual funds and alternative investment funds. The first being Bangladesh Securities and Exchange Commission Mutual Fund Rules 2001 and Bangladesh Securities and Exchange Commission Alternative Investment Rules 2015. Now, here is a step-by-step structure of how these trust funds work. At first, as you can see, the investor buys units of the trust fund, putting money into the fund, as I've just stated. The fund money then is invested in corporations and companies in order to buy shares. Then, the profits made by the companies are paid back to the trust funds as dividends, because essentially the trust funds have now become shareholders of the companies after they bought the shares. Then, the trust, through its trustee, distributes the profits received from the companies to its original investors. So that's how the structure works. And here is a very simple flow chart for your convenience. So you can see there the trust fund in the middle is where the investors at the top put in their money, and the trust fund then buys the shares of the company, and the company then pays dividends if it makes profit back to the fund, and eventually at the end the fund distributes the profits made to the investors on pro rata basis. Now we come to the crux of the matter, that is imposition of tax. For our purposes, the relevant law is given under Section 54 of the Income Tax Ordinance 1984. Tax is deducted by a company at the time of paying dividend on the amount of such dividend under Section 54. So what Section 54 says is that when a company pays dividend to its shareholders, it deducts the necessary amount of tax before paying the dividend. Now, applying this law in our scenario of mutual investments, mutual funds and alternative investment funds, what happens is, in case of mutual funds and alternative investment funds, dividends paid by the companies to the trust are subjected to tax deduction under Section 54 of the Income Tax Ordinance. If you could look at the flow chart there, particularly the highlighted bit, you'll see that after the trust fund has invested into the companies and the companies have declared dividend, and when the company is about to pay dividend back to the trust fund, it deducts tax under Section 54. Now, up until now, all is well and good. The interesting bit happens right after this. So, dividend has very recently been redefined by Finance Act 2017. Dividend is now deemed to include any distribution of profit of a mutual fund or an alternative investment fund under Section 2, subsection 26, triple D of the Income Tax Ordinance 1984. This is a very recent change brought about by the Finance Act. Now, this has serious implications. How does this change in the definition of dividend apply to our scenario? As we can see, in case of mutual funds and alternative investment funds, the profits now being distributed by the trust to the investors are deemed to be dividends and are again subjected to tax deduction under Section 54 of the Income Tax Ordinance. So what has happened is, in the previous slide we saw that when the company was paying dividends to the trust fund, it was deducting tax. Now, the profits that are distributed by the trust fund to the original investors are also defined as dividend under the new law, under the new amendment. So essentially, Section 54 comes back to play again. Since these profits that are being distributed to the original investors are now also known as dividends, Section 54 makes it incumbent upon the companies, upon the trust fund, to deduct tax again. So this raises few serious problems. The first problem being, the obvious problem, double taxation. What has happened after the new amendment is that the original small investor, or the investor who is hoping to receive profit at the end of the day, is being taxed twice in the process. At first, he is being taxed at the time of being paid to the trust fund by the company. When the companies are paying dividends to trust fund, at that point, his profit is being taxed. And again, at the time of being distributed by the trust to the original investor. So, the profit that the investor is due to receive at the end of the day has been taxed twice. Once by the company when paying into the trust, and then again by the trust when paying back to the investors. So this is a clear case of double taxation, and double taxation, as we all know, are barred by our laws. There are many cases that have barred double taxation. One cannot impose tax on a given income more than once. Other than this problem, there is another technical problem that needs to be addressed. That is inconsistency between Sections 54 and Section 2, subsection 26, triple D of the Income Tax Ordinance 1984. Now, as we know that profit of mutual fund or alternative investment fund are taxed under Section 54 now, since those profits are now known as dividends. Section 54, interestingly, directs only companies to deduct tax while paying dividend. Now, this is very interesting because when the profits, which are now known as dividends, are being given back to the investors, it is being given back by the trust fund itself. Now, please bear with me. The trust fund, the trust itself is a person under the Income Tax Ordinance. Section 2, subsection 46 of the Income Tax Ordinance defines trust as a person. So, in this situation, what is happening is, when the trust fund is distributing profit to the original investors, it is required under Section 54 to deduct tax. But then again, Section 54 makes it very clear that only companies can deduct tax. So there is a very clear discrepancy between the provisions of Sections 54 and Section 2, subsection 26, triple D of the Income Tax Ordinance. So this clearly raises the question, can the trust deduct tax under Section 54, not being a company? And if not, can the profit of mutual fund or an alternative investment fund then be termed as dividend under Section 2, subsection 26, triple D of the Income Tax Ordinance? Now, these are very specific issues that I've addressed here before you, but the consequences are quite vast. Small investors in our country will be affected by the fact that the profits they're who are about to receive are now known as dividends, because their income will eventually end up being taxed twice. And in fact, the small investors at the very moment are being affected, and capital market are being affected, which is why this issue has been raised before the regulator itself, that is Bangladesh Securities and Exchange Commission. Now our esteemed panel will kindly shed some light on how to address this issue. I'm not sure whether this has been already addressed before our course, but this is an issue that is quite right to be addressed at the moment. This is just an issue amongst many other issues that emanate from our tax laws that have direct impact on the corporate scene of Bangladesh. Hence, I feel obliged to bring this before your notice, and perhaps the distinguished panelists will address the issues. That is all from me. Thank you very much.